Hi, this is Emily Freitag, and I'm so pleased today to be talking to Don Hirsch, E.D. Hirsch, as many know from his books, and a wealth of knowledge for us. Today, we are particularly going to be digging in to talk about literacy in its fullest form and what we know about what works in equipping children with a full understanding of literacy. Thank you so much for taking the time and joining us today. And please begin, as we ask all to, with your journey personally as a learner.
Well, I started out as getting my doctorate in English literature, but it was an intellectual history dissertation, and it was about a German, Wordsworth, the English poet, and Friedrich Schelling, who was Hegel's contemporary and friend in German philosophy. And so I was already very intimate, as I say, with European Romanticism, which a lot of people agree is the primary influence on Dewey, who's a primary influence on American education schools. And so I'm quite aware of the sort of the intellectual impulses that created our orientation to schooling. But the difficulty was that then my next phase in my intellectual career was theory of interpretation, which of course got me into psycholinguistics and the science of language. And in the elementary grades, which is my chief focus, language is primary. I mean, that's not something that you hear very much, I guess, these days, because the Romantic movement was against the linguistic emphasis of schooling in the old days. But everything depends on mastery of language, because as we now know, and this leads to your point about what do we know in language comprehension, which of course is primary to reading comprehension, and also to learning in the classroom. Language is the vehicle, and so language mastery is and should be the focus, but it turns out that language, what does he know of language who only language knows? Language is totally dependent, as we now know from psycholinguistics, and the developments that occurred right about the mid-60s of last century. It's the most important insight into language in the history of linguistics, I would say, and that is the dependence on language comprehension on things that aren't seen and aren't heard. So the sounds are meaningless without the knowledge that exists in the listener or the reader.
Yes, I am a very fluent German reader with zero comprehension of what I am reading.
You say you are?
Yeah, I can read German. It's very phonetic,
oh,
right?
German.
Yeah, and yet understand very little.
Well, that's true. You can pronounce the sounds
right
from the. Okay, well, but if take something as simple as Polly put the kettle on, we'll all have tea. I mean, and that's followed by Suki, take it off again. They've all gone away. And who in the heck could understand what that means unless you have a hell of a lot of, certainly the infant to whom it is sung doesn't understand it. And here's another interesting point. The English understand that rhyme differently from the way we do, which is saying something about the nature of a speech community, which is, I would say, the way to formulate my point of view and what people could possibly learn from my studies of the subject is that the classroom must be a speech community if you want to reach everybody. You and I are very interested in overcoming disadvantage. The disadvantage is in linguistic comprehension. That is, we're focused on the elementary school, but if you want children to be able to go to college ultimately and have a good career and a successful life, no matter your ethnicity and color or anything else, you have to master the medium of discourse, the medium of communication, and the level. And you do notice that American scores, American verbal scores, have taken a huge nosedive over the last 30 years. Well, that's a national disaster because those reading scores say something about how unified we can be as a country because they're dependent on shared knowledge. Shared knowledge is the basis for linguistic comprehension. Background knowledge that isn't heard. Polly put the kettle on, we'll all have tea. It depends on knowing what have tea means. If you don't know that, it's pretty meaningless. And then put the kettle on what? And what is a kettle? What's in the kettle? But it's not just those dictionary meanings that are very important. Way beyond dictionary meanings. You can know what kettle means. You can know what having tea basically means. But there's a whole, and that's the interesting subtle distinction between how an English person would understand that phrase and how an American. They both would understand you have to get together with a group of people and maybe have cookies or something and have a conversation over a cup of tea. And you need to know what a cup of tea is. Okay, but that's just the beginning, because in that nursery rhyme, there are two interesting differences between the English version, which uses the same words, and the American version. In the English version, Polly might not be invited to have tea because Polly happens to be one of those names that's used for a servant. It's a nickname for the actual name Mary. Polly is really Mary. And then in the second stanza, Suki could be another servant and probably is. So you've got a very super elegant household you're talking about. Polly is putting the kettle on and Suki is taking the kettle off. And actually, and they've all, the last stanza is take it off again, they've all gone away. That's supposed to rhyme with tea. And in the 18th century and early 19th century, when the rhyme was written, people in England said tay, they didn't say tea. We know that from various sources.
Tay away.
Tay away, that's right. So anyway, so it's all different overtone between the American version of a simple nursery rhyme and I'm wasting time on that example only because it's about as simple an example as you could get. And you think of what's the difference between an advantaged student and a disadvantaged student. Basically, we've just described it. We've just described, I mean, if you take the English rather complicated understanding as a sort of a super informed linguistic user, well, that's a very different from somebody who hasn't the foggiest idea.
It totally changes the meaning. Yeah.
And so until a classroom, we're going back to the issue of disadvantage and overcoming disadvantage, where elementary school is the chief place where that happens. If everybody is not understanding the language of the classroom, then some are falling behind.
Mm-hmm.
But the language of the classroom to be understood means that there's a whole lot of unspoken knowledge
Mm-hmm.
that has to be gained and known for that language to be understood. There
Mm-hmm.
is no such thing as general reading comprehension skill.
Mm-hmm.
There's only reading comprehension that's available if you have the necessary knowledge to belong to the speech community that is current in the nation. And it's only if you have that background knowledge that you can learn something new, the next step.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And what does that mean? It bloody well means that you've got to have a definite knowledge-based curriculum
Mm-hmm.
in elementary school, and it means all the kids have to be learning basically the same stuff so that they're ready to learn the next thing.
Mm-hmm.
It's all, that's well understood in mathematics,
Mm-hmm.
in arithmetic. You have to learn addition before you can learn multiplication. However, in a very subtle way, it's true for all subjects,
Mm-hmm.
because there's preparatory knowledge that you need in order just to understand what the teacher is saying. By the way, the teacher should be a sage on the stage, not a guide on the side. The teacher is a grown-up, and the kids in elementary school. Now, let me come back to my intellectual history background, which is the Romantics, just for a moment. It all came from Rousseau. Rousseau was the first. He said, you've got to follow nature. You have to take these children out of swaddling clothes and let them be active, let them develop properly. And of course, he was quite right about that. And it was so convincing that, but then Rousseau made another move. He said, that's just the way the children should learn their lessons. They should do what comes naturally.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's incorrect, and it's known to be incorrect.
Mm-hmm.
So in other words, nature is not saying let the child develop and do developmentally appropriate things. Nature is saying teach the child what the child needs to know in your particular society. Tribal competence, that's something else that has happened since Rousseau. Two things. Evolutionary psychology, I say, would be one approach. I mean, this complex mechanism of the human mind. Turns out we have these huge brains that are there in order to make us linguistically able. This basic, in order to form big societies that let the human group multiply, become a big organism that defends all the individual members. And so much bigger is the brain than the apes had, who lead a more solitary life. So what nature discovered was you're not leaving the child to develop the way spiders and birds and what Horace Mann called the lower orders of animated creation. You are actually having to instruct the child into what's needed for the sake of the tribe. It's basically schooling. Rousseau made it an individual development kind of idea. Nature would take care of it all. But nature, these new brain studies are making clear that nature is saying, no, 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 I'm in charge of the child's physical development. But I'm not in charge of the child's education at all. I've got to leave that up to the tribe. So the little German kids become German, and the little French kids become French, and the members of all these different tribes learn what's needed to belong.
Tell us about those studies a little more. What are you referencing, and what I'm fascinated by that.
The brain studies are fascinating. The thing that got me started on that, which is something I hadn't dealt with earlier in my work, was there's a particular article in the National Academy of Sciences publication called "The Microcircuitry of the Neocortex as a tabula rasa." That was the title. Now, of course, the phrase tabula rasa means blank slate. And That was what John Locke said in 1690, that the mind is a white paper, the mind of the child, and he said it on good evidence, and that's what, of course, Rousseau challenged, which, and we've all become Rousseauvians, and but it turns out from these brain researchers that Locke was right. And by the way, there's a whole, if you want to check into that work, there is a huge amount of research going on now on what's called cortical plasticity. The plasticity of the main educational part of the mind, which is the big cortex, which makes our head so big that birth is difficult. That part of the brain is a blank slate. And that's incredibly important for all kinds of things, including all this tossed about word ethnicity and identity and so on, as if those were inborn characteristics, and they're not at all. And it's very possible to have multiple ethnicities and multiple identities. And that's an extremely important point about the curriculum. Why there has to be
take us there. Yeah, take us into how do we build on what you have shown and what many others have shown about the importance of knowledge as a prerequisite to reading, as opposed to reading as a skill.
That's correct.
Accesses knowledge.
Well, what it means is, what's the implication for policy? The implication.
Yes, and in particular, I think we should bring in, in light of multiple identities and multiple ethnicities, like who gets to decide what the knowledge?
Well, that's a different question.
Okay.
The question, let's answer the preliminary question. Should it be decided that in first grade you study this, this, and this, in second grade you study this, this, and this? And my argument is that until that's well defined, then you're really injuring disadvantaged kids, because the language of the classroom, unless you have prepared the knowledge to build on for the next stage of learning, and you're not depending on the household and where the child comes from to understand what's going on in the classroom. That's the only way. That's the only way you can. Beg pardon?
A cold read assessment is inherently biased.
You're keeping kids at a disadvantage unless the language of unless the classroom is a speech community. Speech community is the term that the psychologists use for the group of people who have the background knowledge to understand the collectively what Polly put the kettle on means. And if everybody understands it, then you can take the next step about what do we do about Polly? Should we bandage, make everybody not have servants, whatever the implication is. But it is just like arithmetic in that respect. That is, knowledge builds on knowledge, speech builds on knowledge. So you can't have a kid who's from disadvantaged circumstances really progress up to that child's potential unless the knowledge background is there to take the next step. And kids love knowledge at these early ages.
And can you just, this may be a simplistic question, but just define for us knowledge.
Well, I'm talking about facts. Facts are a word you're not supposed to use. But I mean, of course, a lot more than just facts. But facts are a good place to start. And there's a very good piece in cognitive psychology. There's a distinguished researcher named Paul Kirshner, who with two other colleagues wrote a wonderful piece, so I think it was 2009, about the inefficacy of discovery learning. Discovery learning is a big idea, and its allies. it doesn't work, and it is extremely hard on disadvantaged kids because what are they supposed to discover if they haven't been informed from outside the school? All kinds of things that more advantaged kids have learned. And so the distraction of all of this multiculturalism and ethnicity and so on is that's fine if everybody is studying the same multicultural stuff. But just to have it helter-skelter so that you don't know what the kids have learned when they come into your classroom, that is a sin against equity. And so unless you treat multiculturalism in the right way, you're holding those kids to disadvantage. And besides that, you have a very essentialist notion of ethnicity. Ethnicity, the whole point of schooling is to gain an ethnicity. Historically, that's the point of the elders teaching the children how to be members of the tribe. That's what nature demands and what a good society demands, what a fair society demands. And as to what the contents of that shared knowledge should be, that's up for grabs. It isn't who describes, it's that you've got to put a gun to the timorous people who you say you're addressing, the policymakers, and say, you've got to decide what your state is going to teach first graders. The states have the power of deciding the elementary school curriculum.
And states have standards.
I'm sorry?
States have set standards, right? And
oh yeah, but they're empty.
So what would full standards look like?
Well, I started a foundation about 30 years ago called Core Knowledge Foundation. And its main product for many years was something called the Core Knowledge Sequence. And it says in first grade, these are the things you study. In second, and so a list, and those core knowledge schools now is 30 years later, there are a couple of thousand of them, and they're doing wonderfully because everybody's studying the same things. That can be up for grabs. I mean, sure, have a conversation about what the content should be, but that they should be the same for all the kids is critical to basically critical to the nature of human education. Human education is education into a tribe.
Yeah.
And if you don't learn the tribal lore, then you're not a competent member of the tribe.
And we've explored grade level in some of these conversations. Take us into your thoughts on grade level, and in particular, the tension between notions of grade level and notions of learning being something that does happen over time.
It turns out to, I don't know why, by the way, that idea is rather a leftover from Rousseau. That is to say, the idea of learning being a kind of natural growth. There is no subject that is particular to a grade level. Ask any first-class cognitive psychology psychologist about that issue. It all depends on what you already know, whether you are ready for the next thing to learn. I mean, it's obviously not a very good idea to teach second graders the details of sex education. That would be, but that's related to a general natural development. Of course not. But there's a tale, I'll tell you an anecdote about that. It's stuck in my mind. There was a core knowledge teacher who told me this anecdote. It was in a school in Riverside, California. And she said one day she saw this girl prancing around and on the playground and said, the second grader who said, I'm so excited. I'm so happy today. He said, well, why are you happy? He says, well, we're going to learn about the War of 1812 today. And she says, well, what's that about? And the second grader said, I don't know, but today I'm going to find out. And I mean, there's an eagerness to learn. And you could say, well, it's not, and by the way, kids obviously in the core knowledge schools have been learning about the War of 1812 for years now. It hasn't hurt them a bit. They've all gone on to college and done extremely well, black, white, and everything. But the college record of those schools is quite impressive. And it seems to me, if you talk about equity, that's a pretty concrete thing to aim at. If the kids who come out of your school system all go to a good college, first to a good high school, and then to a demanding high school, and then to a good college, okay, your problem has been.
Yeah, I do like your focus on elementary. Take us a little bit more into this question of who gets to decide. Just because I think
I'm not interested in that.
Okay.
I think the interesting thing, what does it matter who decides if the decisions are good? But the states should decide.
The states have the power to decide.
I would say the governor of any particular state, and then if a couple of governors got together, their states would make such strides in equity and proficiency.
And how is what you're talking about different than the science and social studies standards that are enumerated?
I'm sorry, say that again.
How is the core knowledge sequence of learning different than the science and social studies standards that are?
Well, the social studies standards, I haven't. Are there new ones out now? Is that what you're saying?
Each state has their own.
Oh, yes, that's the point. And how are they different? Well, I would suppose you would say that a lot of there is still a strong component of this awful development that started with progressive education of the expanding horizons idea, which I think you're familiar with, right? And well, essentially it has no content. So take something from your community and then expand it and so on. No, and there's an antipathy to facts. If you don't like facts, then it's hard to study history. I don't, you have to ask somebody else about the politics of who decides. I think it's essentially to get lost in that point and then pretend it's a hopeless case because who's going to decide what what we impose on the kids. We adults have a duty to do that if we want to achieve equity. We have to decide. And so I think the answer is we the people do ultimately, because we elect these governors. These governors have the power to say, this is going to be the school curriculum. Who's going to challenge my governor? They can say, they can protest, they can march in streets, they can do all kinds of things. But nonetheless, the exam is going to be based on the sequence of knowledge. So I think what you have to say is who decides is some bureaucrats who have a certain amount of courage. That's who decides. And they may consult anybody they want. And I also think—
But not deciding is inherently damaging to equity.
Not deciding is damaging the disadvantaged kids most. They're the kids who get hurt the most by not deciding. And then pretending that not deciding is a virtue, that's even more, once you understand the real situation, that's even more
of a problem.
Well, of a problem.
So, two final questions, and I've deeply enjoyed this. Thank you for the time. The metaphors, mental metaphors about learning are something we have talked about some in this series. The idea, for example, linear, like the dominoes falling. One domino falls, then another. We've explored and debunked, that being true, which really is underpinning a lot of how we think about, I have to meet kids where they are, for example. Another might be,
well, you have to put them where they should be, and then you can meet them so that everybody's learning what they need to learn. That the idea of that, you have to meet kids where they are. Let's challenge that right from the start. No, you have to bring kids to the point where they need to be to understand the next thing they need to learn. These are ways of, to my mind, of abandoning responsibility. But I don't say it that way, because people have been trained in this metaphor of development. But I think that's the word we should take a look at. Development. A child's mind does not develop the way a child's body does. The analogy between the child's development of a body, which is in the control of nature, is not the case with the child's mind. And all you need to see that that's going on is this little example of the little French kid, or the little German kid, or the little English kid, or the little Vietnamese child, or the Chinese. They're all learning all kinds of different stuff. It's not an inherent development at all. And also, I think for this subject, you need to interview top cognitive psychologists. People, I had a very good exchange with this wonderful gal who talked about bootstrapping. I'm not very good at names anymore, but
no problem.
She's in Harvard Psych department.
Okay, I'll follow up and get the name.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, agreed. We are talking to some education psychologists, but I think we need to make sure we have all the right voices. So, final thought. You've explored a lot about what we know works and what we know does not work. As leaders prepare to go back to school in this very changed context, given coronavirus, given social distancing, and in this time of violence against Black Americans, and a time that is very important, searching time for us as a country.
Well, when you talk about disadvantaged and so on, Black Americans are in a cycle of disadvantage, partly because of prejudice, but partly because they're not given the right educational chances. And that's entirely the result of educational romanticism, which is says that the teacher should be a guide on the side and let discovery learning happen, and all these leftovers from progressive education make for an indifferent or undefined curriculum. The undefined curriculum is the biggest source of educational disadvantage in this country. And until people have the courage to define the common curriculum, and the states have the duty really to do that. And I think if a couple of states got together, the results would be so remarkable that then that would turn into a national curriculum. But of course, that's what all the good educational systems have. We are alone in thinking it's a bad idea, and we're led to believe it's a bad idea because we believe that children should develop as individuals and not as members of a society.
Well, I think that is a good note to close on. Thank you so much for the time and the discussion, Don
Okay, Emily.
Hirsch, and we look forward to continuing this learning journey together as we rethink intervention and really rethink education.
Well, I hope you're successful. Thank you.
Thank you.